talks we've been having, I'm afraid. And I'm going to talk, although at the end I'm going to expand the discussion slightly, I'm going to talk about issues to do with liberal education and the state, which is something we do have to consider. The liberal educator, that is, the educator who believes that there is a duty to initiate the young into the best that has been thought and known, need not deny that education is in some sense a social concern, nor that society as a whole has an interest and even a paternalistic duty in seeing that its members are educated. Both Newman and Arnold, in their different ways, saw an educated population as a good in itself, something that would leaven and civilize the society it made up, and so did Mill, who was mentioned yesterday. But as Mill saw with compelling clarity, saying that is one thing, saying, as is taken as almost axiomatic these days, that therefore the state should take charge in education is quite another. In chapter 5 of On Liberty, Mill warned that a general state education is a mere contrivance for moulding people to be exactly like one another, and that in proportion as it is efficient and successful, it establishes a despotism over the mind, leading to one over the body. One may of course have doubts about the efficiency of the enterprise, but looking at the materials of the English national curriculum as it was under New Labour from 1997 to 2010, there can be no doubt about an intention of just the kind that Mill feared, an overwhelming and overweening drive within it to produce a certain set of attitudes on topics such as multiculturalism, environmentalism, citizenship, social justice, and even the European Union. Amazingly, according to the Single European Act of 1986, we in Britain are now bound by law to bring out the pro-European dimension of every topic in the curriculum. I discovered that when I was involved in rewriting the English national curriculum, and I was told that by the civil servants who said that we should implement this directive, which you'll be pleased to know I completely ignored. Now, in discussing this question, and I mean the Single European Act was a disaster, unfortunately signed by Mrs. Thatcher. But anyway, in discussing this question, we may treat the influence of the state and its bureaucracies as if they were, in a sense, neutral phenomena, simply administering policies laid down by rulers and politicians in a disinterested way. In practice, though, we know both from experience and from the findings of public choice theory that bureaucracies are never disinterested players. And I speak here from personal experience, having been on at least 4 senior government committees, formulating both the national curriculum for England and also teacher training directives, and recently I've been involved in rewriting the national standards for teachers in England. And I stress in England because these do not apply in Wales and Scotland, which are moving in a completely different direction from us in England on educational matters. So that's one of the fruits of, if I can put it like that, of devolution. However, everything that we do will be wiped away in England as soon as the next government comes in, whenever that is. Anyway, bureaucracies always have their own interests to pursue, their own empires to build up, their own influence and power to expand. And while this need not necessarily be sinister in itself, no bureaucracy is likely to favour an activity whose aims and rationale are essentially in tension with a managerial bureaucratic approach, and also essentially to place its adherents at least at one mental remove from the state. The aims of liberal education certainly are, in that they involve values which are unquantifiable and which will seem to the managerial mind to be unaccountable, and aims which may well be critical of the forms of economic utility and social levelling beloved of the politician and the bureaucrat. And so no one in today's world should be surprised to learn what underpinned the English national curriculum from 1997 to 2010. In its statement of the values underlying it, we were told that education is a route to equality of opportunity for all, a healthy and just democracy, a productive economy and sustainable development, valuing diversity in our society and the environment in which we live. Given that any genuine equality of opportunity will necessarily involve continuous discounting of unequal outcomes at any stage, and given that the politics of diversity amount in practice to a refusal to admit differences of quality between, say, the art of the ghetto and that of Bach and Rembrandt, as well as a repudiation of the idea of culture as one inclusive conversation, these are anything but neutral requirements. Though the liberal educator may hope from his work for a social leavening and other desirable social ends, it is a leavening which will occur, if at all, through the care and nurture of the soul of the individual, as Plato taught us, and by the cultivation of the best that has been thought and known, and of those who are the best. This aristocracy of talent need not and should not imply a regime of social barriers, but the alternative is the situation dreaded by both Plato and Matthew Arnold, in which those with most talent trap down to the level of the lowest tastes, keeping those from educationally underprivileged backgrounds firmly in their place, not letting them learn Latin, for example, by flattering them into believing that there is nothing better to aspire to than their own uneducated tastes, rather how the mass media work in today's world, in fact. Nor should we forget that the modern world and the politics of the modern state, above all, are aspects of what Plato called the great beast. The great beast is the public world, which can be pulled in any direction by the force of public opinion without regard to truth or justice. In a populist democracy, public opinion is easily manipulated by propaganda and the mass media. And all this is highly corrosive of the type of serene individualism the liberal educator endeavours to foster, and so we shouldn't be surprised if the modern state hardly wants to cherish institutions of liberal education. But over and above all this, there is yet another aspect to liberal education which would make its promotion problematic for the modern state. As will be evident from a glance at its history, there are among its devotees and forebears, both Christian and pre-Christian, a striking number of thinkers who are explicitly committed to a belief in the supernatural destiny of mankind. Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, through to Ruskin, Newman, Tawney, T.S. Eliot, C.S. Lewis, and Dorothy Sayers in more modern times. From the point of view of these thinkers, the formation involved in a program of liberal education is part of the way we would respond to our nature as having a destiny not confined to this world. At the very least, liberal education leaves open the possibility that human beings have a calling which is open and not confined to any ulterior ends, economic, political, social, or, as Newman stressed, even moral. Our intellectual and aesthetic sensibilities are treated as ends in themselves, worthwhile in themselves. A full analysis of these faculties may well see them as having a transcendent aspect, not just worthwhile in themselves, which they are, but as crucial aspects of our spiritual nature. Aristotle and Newman would have analysed our intellectual faculties in these terms. In Newman's case, as we see from the idea of a university, what liberal education aims at is that illuminative reason and true philosophy, which is the power of viewing many things at once as one whole, of referring them severally to their true place in the universal system, of understanding their respective values, and determining their mutual dependence. But if this power is not to be a mere intellectual fastidiousness, which is often found among the highly educated, and can be little more than a form of snobbery, as actually Newman warned, it will need a context against which to make these judgments. Secular reason has proved incapable of overcoming the fissiparous nature of the intellectual disciplines, something we've heard a bit about already, and the unity of the sciences, much trumpeted, I don't remember in the 1920s and 30s, but I remember a lot of talk about that, remains as elusive as ever it was. Newman's conclusion is that universalizing and synthesizing aspirations of intellectual endeavor, which he is seeking, make sense only against the background of a unifying and legitimately upheld divine order, something which Alistair MacIntyre has also been mentioned, has recently argued. However, even if liberal education does not presuppose transcendent context, which some of its adherents, such as Michael Oakeshott would, and probably David Hume, would not think, in its pursuit of the best that has been thought and known, it will be fairly naturally predisposed to the idea that there are truths about man and nature which are timeless, which transcend time and fashion. Whereas, as we see with Dewey, the whole drift of modern politics, and education indeed, is towards a progressive pragmatism, the idea that there is no ultimate truth, but that each generation has to work out for itself its own solutions to its own problems, leaving behind what it would see as a dead past, offering only old solutions to yesterday's problems. Add to that the point that liberal education aims at the nurturing of mentally free individuals, independent of and not beholden to the great beast in its collective manifestations. The inevitable conclusion is that it would be very unwise to rely on the modern state for a system of liberal education, or for any defence of those bits of liberal education which have managed to survive within its systems of education and training. Indeed, far from expecting the state to defend education, we should expect hostility, overt or covert. And for example, Labour introduced in England, or actually in the whole of Britain, a requirement that universities and subjects within universities have to show, quote, social and economic impact to get funding. And that has not been repealed by the Department of Business, under which universities still rest in the current dispensation. So that's just an example of the general drift of the collectivism, which I think inspires policies in the modern state. So for the leftists, there will be a stress on citizenship and social equality, and they're of course dominant in the field. For conservatives in the 19th century, for example, education was supposed to be promoting nationalism. Basic skills for economic productivity for the marketeers and wealth creators, or maybe a combination of all three in today's typical social democracy. In a certain sense, some or all of these purposes might be served by a course of liberal education, but only as byproducts of a system with quite other ends in view. Now, a growing system with other ends in view, in which at least 3% of children are educated in the United States, almost a couple of million, I think, is homeschooling. And I'm just going to say a little bit about that. Homeschooling curriculum materials often contain plenty of coverage of that core of liberal education, the great books, considerably more in many cases than pupils will encounter in state-run schools. At least they would have before we reformed the national curriculum. Let's see what happens. And for many homeschoolers, or at least for those helping and influencing them, Dorothy L. Sayers, a translator of Dante, by the way, her The Lost Tools of Learning, which advocates a Christian classical education, appears to be an inspiration, if not actually a manifesto. Let us amuse ourselves, she said in 1947, by imagining that a progressive retrogression is possible. Let us make a clean sweep of all educational authorities and furnish ourselves with a nice little school of boys and girls whom we may experimentally equip for the intellectual conflict along lines chosen by ourselves. We will endow them with exceptionally docile parents. We will staff our schools with teachers who are themselves perfectly familiar with the aims and methods of the trivium. Now it seems that many not so docile parents are doing more these days than simply amusing themselves. Bypassing teachers, they are actually putting into effect in their own homes something like Sayers' interpretation of the trivium. This is a rather generous one, which has the trivium encompassing most of what followers of Newman and Arnold would hope to include in a decent liberal education for children, under the medieval headings of grammar, dialectic or logic, and rhetoric. The trivium will then lead, Sayers hopes, to the mental liberation and ability to go further in whatever sphere which comes about through having a mind prepared in this way. One key aspect of Sayre's proposal is that in it she distinguishes 3 stages in a child's development, which she characterises as poll parrot, pert and poetic, and to each one of which the 3 elements correspond. Learning by heart, that's grammar, is appropriate to the first stage in areas such as foreign languages, including Latin of course, poetry, mathematical tables, scientific and historical facts, and the basic elements of the Christian story. In the pert stage, the pupil begins to analyse and argue about what is learnt, that's dialectic, while elements of self-expression enter into the third, poetic stage, rhetoric, which coincides with adolescence and which pedagogically culminates in Sayre's vision in the presentation of some topic in which the pupil has taken a particular interest. With this background, to be completed by the age of 16, Sayers argues that pupils will be as well prepared as their medieval predecessors of the same age to enter university and move on to the quadrivium, that is, the more advanced study of arithmetic, geometry, music and astronomy, leading on in the medieval scheme of things to philosophy and theology. Now, tongue-in-cheek as some of Sayre's proposals may be, and irritatingly arch as I find her style, the spirit of what she has to say has certainly enthused many homeschoolers too. Formally, The Lost Tools of Learning has become the pedagogical Bible for the Association of Christian and Classical Schools, on whose website the article can be found. This association was started in 1991 and now comprises, or did in 2010, probably more now, 220 schools educating 33,000 pupils. What might seem strange to the outsider is that Dorothy Sayre's dream of a revived medievalism whose highest fruits were Chartres Cathedral, the great universities of Oxford, Cambridge, Paris and Bologna, the theology of Thomas and Scotus, the painting of Cimabue and Giotto and the Divine Comedy, should go hand in hand with a narrow and intolerant approach to religion and a literalistic approach to scripture, as well as a formal rejection of, quote, the follies of ancient paganism. Yet this is precisely what appears to happen in the Association of Christian and Classical Schools. Now, this was set up as a result of the publicity given to a book published a few years ago called Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning. Its author was Douglas Wilson, who had set up the Logos School in Moscow, Idaho, supposedly on Sayersian lines, which he describes in the book. And the Logos School remains the flagship institution of the Association of Christian and Classical Schools. Wilson himself has gone on to gain national fame or notoriety in the US for his uncompromisingly fierce Old Testamental views on homosexuality and adultery and his debates with Christopher Hitchens. The ACCS has powerfully resounding statements of what their Christianity means. Some flavour of what comes to is suggested by the following statement from Wilson himself. It is said among us, if we continue to maintain that God created the world in 6 days, we will not be granted academic respectability, to which we might reply, well, who cares? Why should we care that the guardians of the Academy believe we are not intellectually respectable? They believe that the moose, the sperm whale, and the mongoose are all blood relatives. Why do we want their seal of approval? It's like asking Fidel Castro to comment on the economic viability of Microsoft. And St. Anthony's New College, like the Logos School associated with Wilson, has a part of its statement of faith, the proposition that God created the material universe from nothing in 6 days. As far as I can make out, the Association of Christian and Classical Schools does not explicitly require its members to subscribe to creationism, although they are expected to affirm that the Bible is the only inerrant word of God and the only authoritative rule for faith and practice, the Bible. This is not the case with Patrick Henry College, which makes all its trustees, administrators and faculty attest to the proposition that humans and each kind of organism resulted from God's distinct and supernatural creative intervention and did not result from a natural evolutionary process, and get this, nor from an evolutionary process God secretly directed. Thus, even a fairly standard attempt to reconcile evolution and a literalistic Christianity is blocked off. They also don't like homosexuals and many others. Quote, any sexual conduct outside the parameters of marriage is sin. And in the college's biblical worldview applications, the teaching of six-day creationism alongside Darwinism is explicitly mandated, even in biology courses, with faculty being selected on the basis of their personal adherence to six-day creationism. Now, you might think this is all ridiculous, but the relevance of this to the current discussion is that Patrick Henry College, which is just outside Washington, which has considerable academic and debating success, and also with getting its graduates internships in Washington, D.C., was set up in 2000 by the Homeschooling Defense Association as a university which would cater specifically for homeschooled students, and it prides itself on following a classical liberal arts curriculum. Wheaton College, to take a further example of an institution favoured by homeschoolers, while also being committed to Christian liberal arts, requires its faculty and staff to affirm annually that God directly created Adam and Eve, the founders of the entire human race. Sex outside marriage, with homosexual relations explicitly mentioned, and also alcohol and tobacco are off limits for its undergraduates, while the righteous are commended to, quote, confront backsliders, get this, in love. Now, while it is more than possible that liberal education could be associated with Christianity in some form, and while it is certain that a liberal education here and now will have for its subject matter many works produced within a Christian context, and while I've just argued that liberal education may well have a religious dimension, it is impossible to reconcile the spirit of liberal education, I think, its spirit of liberal generosity, with the hectoring and dogmatic tone of the institutions I've just been looking at. And I think this is a danger we have to be careful of. And not that Benedictus is going to do this, but that there are places that might look similar, but need to be looked at a bit more. I finished the knockabout stuff. I'm just going to draw a more serious conclusion. Late in his life, Newman watched with dismay the promulgation of the doctrine of the infallibility of the Pope and the narrow-mindedness of the First Vatican Council. But then, shortly before he turned his mind to educational topics, setting up University College Dublin and writing the idea of a university, he had argued for the idea of the development of doctrine in an essay on the development of Christian doctrine in 1845, an idea which both Protestants and Catholics of certain bents might find difficult, but which might serve as a model for liberal education itself. For a doctrine that develops is one which is essentially open-ended, unfinished, not necessarily fully articulated, or even anticipated in its first formulations, receptive to shaping by new and old voices, unpredictable, requiring on the part of its adherents a knowledge of and love for its earlier moments and contributions, and a sense of being true to their spirit. And as far as the earlier history of a doctrine goes, Newman is happy to talk of its later development as being in the early time unperceived, and he also makes considerable play of the way new circumstances and influences will motivate later development. In his own analysis, Newman gives 7 notes or criteria by which a genuinely developing doctrine can be distinguished from a doctrinal corruption. These are: 1, that in the development there is preservation of its type. Preservation, that is, rather than eradication. 2, that in a genuine development there is continuity of principles, as when, for example, a newly discovered work is judged by its stylistic similarity to the work of some known author. 3, that a genuinely developing doctrine is one that has assimilative power, that is, that it can incorporate new influences and respond to new circumstances without being engulfed by them. 4, that there is a logical sequence of the development with one element leading to another. 5, that the doctrine has anticipation of its future, that is, its later developments can be seen as being, in a sense, implicit in the earlier stages. 6, that a genuine development manifests conservative action on its part, that is, it doesn't destroy past meaning. And 7, that the doctrine itself and the developments of it manifest what he calls chronic vigour, That is, they survive over time and do so vigorously, which is rather in the spirit of Hume's test of time. That is the sense that a genuinely canonical work has the power to appeal in different times and places and to different audiences, and are even refreshed and renewed in the process, rather than turning out to be an artifact of a temporary vogue or fashion. Now, the notion that doctrines can and should develop runs counter, of course, to the idea of there being a once and for all statement of faith, as we get, for example, from the Association of Christian Catholic Schools, and would, of course, and this is why Newman wrote it, would, of course, preclude the Marian doctrines Newman was keen to defend as being truly Christian. Of course, they weren't defined in the early ages of the Church. But it is also against the idea that each man is his own pope. Faith, in Newman's view, is the prerogative of the community of believers over time. And actually, he reinterpreted for himself the doctrine of the infallibility of the papacy as being the Pope was only infallible when the Pope was simply formulating ideas that were already held by the whole magisterium. Doctrines are not explicitly realized once and for all, but they develop, tried and tested in what, in another context, F.R. Leavis referred to as a continuing collaborative critical dialogue. As Newman pointed out, the doctrines of the Trinity and the Incarnation had emerged over centuries in just such a way, and we might add, can hardly be said to have been given exhaustively analysed accounts even now. Not surprisingly, Newman's doctrine came under inquisitorial fire when it was invoked, quite reasonably, by the unfortunate modernists of the early 20th century. But that says more about the attitude of the Vatican bureaucracy, I think, than it does about Newman's vision. In all these aspects, though, Newman's analysis of the development of doctrine would seem to be a very good model for the spirit of liberal education itself, and of the conversations over time and over generations which such an education should attempt to foster, which is partly why I've spent a little time looking at what Newman has to say. But if any of this is correct on either the side of religious doctrine or on the side of the conversation of mankind, it becomes hard to see the attitude to religion of the forms of contemporary conservative Christianity in the USA, which we've just been looking at, as compatible with what one might hope for in a liberal education. Reluctantly, I'm forced to see Patrick Henry College and the rest as at best parasitic simulacra of liberal education, despite their invocation of Dorothy Sayers and their profession of adherence to what they call the Christian classical tradition. If one were to be cynical, one might take the inclusion of classical in the Christian classical school movement as being an attempt to mask what is really going on, and to gain a form of intellectual respectability for something that's not respectable at all. That would be too cynical, though, of a movement which doubtless involves many sincere and well-meaning teachers and parents. But I wonder what the students in the institutions we've been examining make of the classical past they are studying. Homer, Horace, Ovid, Lucan, Virgil, all admired, of course, by the Christian Dante, to say nothing of Sappho, Plato of the poetry in the Symposium, Anacreon, Catullus and Propertius, who are all certainly part of the classical tradition, and from whom even, or perhaps especially, Christian fundamentalists might learn more about themselves than perhaps they wanted. It is often remarked that there was something strange about the admixture of muscular Christianity with the Greek and Roman love poets in the English public schools of the 19th century. I would prefer to take an Arnoldian view and say that it was precisely this mixture of Hellenism and Hebraism and the necessary tension between the two which was their strength, and which I hope will be the strength of Benedictus too.